Hard Times. The Charles Dickens Children's Collection. Grumpy Old Gradgrind. A long time ago, in the middle of England, there was a dull, dusty town called Coketown. It was full of factories, huge, looming, red brick factories with hundreds of windows that watched over the town like the eyes of giants. The streets where the townspeople lived were very similar to each other. And the lives of the townspeople were very similar too. Every day they woke up at the same time, ate the same measly breakfast, and went to work in the same sooty factories. As you can imagine, life in Coketown was very dull and very boring. Except that, in Coketown, you couldn't imagine anything. There was no space for imagination. The only things that mattered in Coketown were cold, hard facts. Facts and figures and money, of course. Money mattered. Mr. Thomas Gradgrind ran a school near Coketown. He too was only interested in facts, figures and money. Everything about Mr. Gradgrind was straight or square. He's solid, square forehead and straight, dark eyebrows that cast a permanent shadow over his eyes. At this moment, Mr. Gradgrind's square-tipped finger was pointing towards a young girl. "Who is that girl?" he snapped, his mouth twisting into a frown. "I'm Sissy Jupe, sir," the girl said. "Sissy is not a name," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Do not call yourself Sissy. Call yourself Cecilia." "It is my father who calls me Sissy, sir," she explained in a trembling voice. "Then he must stop doing that," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Tell him that he must never call you Sissy again." "What does your father do?" He works in a circus, sir." Judging by the expression on Mr. Gradgrind's face, it was clear that he did not approve of the circus. "My father works with horses," said Sissy. "Is that so? Tell me, Cecilia, what is your definition of a horse?" asked Mr. Gradgrind. Sissy Jupe looked confused. "A horse is a horse, how else could you define it?" Sissy said nothing. Her face turned a deep shade of red. "The girl is unable to define a horse," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Which boy can tell me what a horse is?" "How about you, Bitzer?" The boy called Bitzer had very fair hair and freckles. "A quadruped," he said. "Meaning that a horse has 4 legs." "Graminivorous," he said. "Meaning that a horse eats grass." "A horse has 40 teeth and hard hooves." "Though hard, horses' hooves are also given iron shoes?" Bitzer said a lot more. At each point Mr. Gradgrind nodded his head in approval. "Very well," he said, smiling and folding his arms. "That is a horse. Now, let me ask, girls and boys. Would you decorate your bedrooms with pictures of horses? What about with wallpaper covered with pictures of horses?" Half the class shouted, "Yes, sir." Seeing that this was the wrong answer, the other half shouted, "No, sir. Of course you would not." "And why not?" Silence. No one knew the answer. "I'll explain, then," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Do you ever see horses walking up and down walls in real life?" "Do you?" "No, sir," said the class. "Of course you do not," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Horses do not walk up walls. So then, why on earth would you cover your walls with pictures of horses? It is ridiculous. You should not see things that aren't real. Forget such silly things as imagination. Forget myths, forget magic, forget fairy tales. Facts are everything. Mr. Gradgrind walked away from the school feeling rather pleased with himself. He may have even had a spring in his step if he approved of such things, which, of course, he did not. So he walked at his usual pace, with his usual serious expression. Mr. Gradgrind's good mood cue lasted until he reached the border of Coketown. There, he paused and looked around. He was sure that he heard the tinkling of joyful music floating on the wind. And he was quite certain that he saw a scattering of colorful wooden caravans. And, good heavens! There was an obnoxiously large, striped tent. The flag flying above it read, Sleary's Circus. Mr. Gradgrind's straight line of a mouth turned once again into a frown. Circuses were colorful and fun, the exact opposite of Coketown. What sort of example would this silly show set his students? The moment they saw a galloping horse, juggling clown or leotard-wearing tightrope walker, they would forget all about the importance of facts and figures. They would want to have fun. Already, children were crouching by a gap in the tent curtains, taking turns to peer at the performers inside. These could not possibly be students from his school. Mr. Gradgrind took his glasses from his pocket and perched them on the end of his nose. What he saw did not please him. Among the curious children were his daughter, Louisa, and his son, Tom. Louisa was 16 and Tom was a year younger. Mr. Gradgrind grabbed hold of his son and daughter and started leading them away. "What on earth are you doing here?" he barked. "I wanted to see what it was like," said Louisa. "The circus is leaving soon and I just had to see it." "What would your friends say, Louisa?" her father tooted. "What would Mr. Bounderby say?" As soon as Mr. Bounderby's name had left her father's mouth, Louisa's face transformed. Her eyes narrowed, her eyebrows crinkled, and her lips were so firmly pressed together that it would have been impossible for her to answer her father's question. "Meet Mr. Bounderby." Mr. Bounderby was a very large man and a very rich one, too. He owned 3 factories and a bank, called Bounderby's Bank. Perhaps because of his wealth, or perhaps it was simply his personality, Mr. Josiah Bounderby thought that he was the most important man in the world. Standing in the best room in Stone Lodge, the home of the Gradgrinds, next to Mrs. Gradgrind, a small, thin woman, who was often ill, Mr. Bounderby looked like a giant. He was boasting in a loud voice to Mrs. Gradgrind about something rather unusual. Not about how rich and powerful he was now, but about how poor and deprived he had been as a child. "I did not have any shoes to cover my little feet," said Mr. Bounderby. "I spent the day of my 10th birthday in a ditch, and the night in a pigsty." "Not that a ditch was new to me, for I was born in a ditch," Mrs. Gradgrind gasped. She said in a feeble voice, "I hope it was at least a dry ditch." "No," cried Mr. Bounderby. "It had a foot of water in it." "But what about your mother?" asked Mrs. Gradgrind. "My mother left me to my grandmother," said Mr. Bounderby. "My grandmother was the wickedest old woman that ever lived. If I got a pair of shoes by any chance, she would take them off me, sell them, and keep the money for herself." He went on to boast of how, after this terrible start in life, he had worked his way up in the world. Now look at him, the owner of 3 factories and a bank. At this moment, Mr. Gradgrind arrived home with Tom and Louisa. If Mr. Gradgrind had one friend in the world, it was Mr. Bounderby. And if Mr. Bounderby had one friend in the world, it was Mr. Gradgrind. But neither man believed in friendship. It wasn't a fact, you see. It wasn't a figure. It couldn't be measured, so to them it did not exist. The 2 men talked about the fact that a girl at school, Sissy Jupe, was the daughter of a circus performer. Mr. Bounderby said she should be thrown out of the school. He said that he and Mr. Gradgrind should go that instant to see her father and tell him that Sissy was no longer welcome due to her connection with the circus. As they left Stone Lodge, Mr. Bounderby called to Louisa, "Goodbye, dearest Louisa." "Goodbye, Mr. Bounderby," Louisa replied coldly. Louisa knew that she was Mr. Bounderby's favorite. She hated that fact and, deep down, she hated Mr. Bounderby too. When Mr. Bounderby and Mr. Gradgrind reached the circus, they found the tents folded away and the signs taken down. The circus was leaving Coketown. That was good. What was not good, however, was that Sissy Jupe's father had left already. He had deserted both Sissy and the circus, and no one knew why. Sissy was scared and sad and all alone. Mr. Gradgrind walked over to where Sissy was sitting, tears raining down her flushed cheeks. "I'll make you an offer," Mr. Gradgrind said, quite out of the blue. "You can leave today with the circus, or you can come to live at Stone Lodge with my family. My wife is very sick. She could do with someone to look after her. You can do that and continue your education." Sissy was shocked. Mr. Gradgrind had never showed kindness like this to anyone. Without much time to think, Sissy agreed. She packed a very small bag and left, waving goodbye to her circus family. The start of Sissy and Louisa. Louisa Gradgrind was very close to her brother, Tom. They both grew up within the bare, boring walls of Stone Lodge, both wishing for music, poetry and paintings, things they were not allowed. Once, as a child, Louisa had turned to her brother and said, "Tom, I wonder but," before she could finish her sentence, Mr. Gradgrind bellowed, "Louisa, never wonder. Wondering leads to imagining, and imagination is not good for anything." From that moment on, Louisa never wondered. She never dreamed or imagined, and soon enough, she even found it difficult to feel things. She was never happy or sad, she was just there. Tom, meanwhile, grew into a sulky, angry young man. One day, Tom said to Louisa, "I wish I could collect all the facts and figures we hear so much about, and all the people who discovered them. I wish I could put 1,000 barrels of gunpowder under them and blow them all up." He may not have liked facts and figures, but Louisa's brother was soon going to start work in Mr. Bounderby's bank. Facts and figures were things he would have to get used to. Sissy Jupe had not been raised in the same way as the Gradgrind children. At first, she did not enjoy living with them. She would sit awake at night, tears blurring her eyes as she thought over and over about running away. She wanted to leave this sad, boring town and go back to the circus and her father. But she could not bear to, because her father was not with the circus anymore. She could leave for somewhere else, anywhere else, but what if, one day, he came back, for her and she was not in Coketown anymore? No. She could not risk it. She would have to stay. Over time, however, Sissy did settle into life at Stone Lodge. She started to look up to Louisa. She thought 10 Louisa was very smart, a lot smarter than people gave her credit for. The two girls were very different from one another. Sissy was kind-hearted and fun, and tried to always be positive, while Louisa was distant and cold. She focused only on facts and never saw much to be positive about. But though different, Sissy and Louisa grew very close. Eventually, it felt as if they were more like sisters than friends. Sissy would tell Louisa stories about her father. She said that he was the circus's funniest clown. That he used to do gravity-defying tricks on horseback and make up hilarious routines with his performing dog, Merrylegs. But with each passing year, he had got older and weaker. His tricks hadn't worked as well as they once had, and he had often injured himself. One day, as the circus was preparing to leave town, Sissy's father had sent her out to buy some healing oil for his bumps and bruises. When she returned, her father had left and taken Merrylegs with him. That was the day that Mr. Gradgrind invited Sissy to live at Stone Lodge. And though she was happy now, she still kept the bottle of healing oil. She thought that her father might need it one day, when he came back. The mysterious old woman. On a cool autumn afternoon, Tom Gradgrind went to visit Mr. Bounderby. They sat in Mr. Bounderby's dim, grey drawing room, drank weak tea and talked endlessly about the boring work that Tom was going to do at Bounderby's bank. Tom did not like the sound of his new job. But he found that he only had to say Louisa would like this or Louisa wouldn't like that for Mr. Bounderby to change his mind about which tasks Tom would have to do. Louisa was his favorite, so whatever Louisa would like would happen. Just as Tom was walking down the stone steps from Mr. Bounderby's front door, he felt something touch his arm. It was the hand of an old woman. She was tall and simply dressed. Her shoes were muddy and tattered, as if she had walked a long way. She carried a large umbrella and a little basket. Waist, sir, if you please, she said. Have you seen the gentleman who lives there? She pointed her umbrella up to Mr. Bounderby's front door. Tom nodded. And how did he look, sir? The old woman asked. Was he well and cheerful? Tom thought of the man he had just left. Did Mr. Bounderby ever look well or cheerful? Not really. But the woman looked worried, so Tom said to her, Yes, he is well and cheerful. Oh, thank you, sir, thank you. I have walked miles today to find that out. I am so pleased to finally hear the answer. Tom walked off, leaving the old woman staring at the large square house in wonder. He was curious about the woman's strange behavior. Why would she walk miles simply to ask if a grumpy old factory owner was well? A not-so-wonderful wedding. A few years went by with no sign of the strange old woman. Mr. Gradgrind continued to run his school, teaching the children about facts and figures. Mr. Bounderby grew richer and richer, thanks to his bank. The bank that poor Tom Gradgrind now worked at. And Louisa Gradgrind? Louisa's life changed on the day her father called her into his study at Stone Lodge. Louisa, he said, very seriously. I have just had a very important talk with a very important man. A man who would like to marry you. Louisa's face fell. Her breath caught in her throat. She had a horrible feeling that she knew which man her father was talking about. Mr. Gradgrind continued, Mr. Bounderby has asked me for your hand in marriage. Father, said Louisa, do you think I love Mr. Bounderby? Mr. Gradgrind looked like he had bitten into a large lemon. Let us stick to the facts, Louisa, he said. Does Mr. Bounderby want to marry you? Yes, he does. That is a fact. The only question you have to answer is, should you marry him? And should I marry him? Asked Louisa, staring at her father. I can't answer that. It has to be you who decides. Mr. Bounderby is much older than I am. Yes, he is. Louisa stood up and walked over to the window. She peered out at the smoking chimneys of Coketown. I will accept Mr. Bounderby's proposal, she said, finally. A wise decision, my dear, said her father. He sounded relieved. As Louisa shut the door to her father's study, she felt a heavy weight drop in her stomach. She felt sick. Hot, salty tears spilt from her eyes. Mr. Bounderby is very rich, she whispered to herself. He has factories and a bank. Marrying him is a wise decision. I am doing the right thing. But the facts did not make her feel any better. Louisa Gradgrind and Mr. Bounderby were married 8 weeks later in a plain grey church in Coketown. Tom was pleased that his sister was marrying Mr. Bounderby. Tom was greedy. He thought that he could use his sister's miserable marriage to get extra money out of Mr. Bounderby. In fact, the only person who was sad about Louisa leaving Stone Lodge was Sissy Jupe. She knew that Louisa did not love Mr. Bounderby. But Sissy did not say anything. A very small robbery. The very moment that Louisa returned from her dreadfully dreary honeymoon with Mr. Bounderby, she heard a knock at the door. "Louisa!" Tom cried as he walked into the large, square hallway of Mr. Bounderby's house. "I hope that you had a wonderful trip. I don't suppose you have a moment of time for your dear brother?" Tom smiled wickedly at his sister's confused face. "You see, I'm in a spot of bother and I could really use your help. I have lost a little money through gambling. Well, a lot of money, really. I was hoping that you could lend me a few pounds to pay my debts." Louisa gave her brother as much money as she could. She loved her brother, it was one of the few emotions she was sure of. And Tom, in his own selfish way, loved his sister, too. But Louisa's money soon ran out, and the people whom Tom owed money to were becoming less patient and more angry with each passing day. Tom's money worries were making him ill. Soon he was pale and thin, and looked much older than his years. More time passed and things moved steadily on. Until, one warm summer's evening, when the factories had shut for the night and the town lay in a sleepy silence, something shocking happened. Someone has broken into the bank. The cry rose throughout the streets until it reached Mr. Bounderby's ears. £150 was stolen. Someone had made a copy of the key to the safe. Then, in the middle of the night, they had broken into the bank, tiptoed down the cold stone halls, opened the safe with the copied key and stolen the money. Mr. Bounderby was raging. He marched off to the bank the moment he heard the news. When he returned home to find that his wife had left him, he was angrier still. Louisa had returned to Stone Lodge and her family. Louisa explained to her father that she and her husband had nothing in common. He was old, she was young. He was only interested in making money, she was not. And they did not love each other. These were facts. "I wish it were different," Louisa said, finally, "but it isn't different and so, and so." But Louisa could not finish what she was saying. She fell to the floor in tears. For only the second time in his life, Mr. Gradgrind was touched not by facts, but by feelings. He gently lifted Louisa up from where she was lying and wrapped his arms around her until, at last, she stopped crying. Then Mr. Gradgrind sent for Sissy Jupe, who still lived in at Stone Lodge. He asked Sissy to look after his daughter. Sissy was happy to help. She had missed Louisa. The two women talked together, walked together and soon felt almost like sisters again. Louisa's heart, once hardened with facts and figures, was starting to soften. Mr. Gradgrind was changing too. Eventually, he decided to go with his wife to see Mr. Bounderby. He was planning to tell his friend that Louisa would not be returning. She would be staying with her family at Stone Lodge. The truth about Mr. Bounderby. While Louisa was settling herself back into life at Stone Lodge, the investigation into the theft at Bounderby's bank continued. A strange old woman had been spotted outside places belonging to Mr. Bounderby. Outside his house, his factories, his bank. She carried a large umbrella and a small basket. It was the same mysterious woman who had spoken to Tom Gradgrind that autumn afternoon. Thinking that she must be the thief, the police arrested her and took her to Mr. Bounderby's house. The mysterious lady was not the only guest at Mr. Bounderby's home that afternoon. The heavy knock on the front door sounded just as Mr. and Mrs. Gradgrind and Tom sat down in Mr. Bounderby's drawing room. A servant showed the policeman and the frightened old woman into the drab drawing room. "Mr. Bounderby, sir," the policeman said. "Here is the person you have been looking for. This lady robbed your bank." Mr. Bounderby's face turned white with shock. His eyes opened wide and his eyebrows raised themselves to sit so far up his forehead that they looked as if they may never come back down. "It was not easy to find this crook, Mr. Bounderby," said the policeman. "But it is always a pleasure to help you. Why did you bring her here?" Mr. Bounderby stuttered. "My dear Josiah," cried the old woman. "My darling boy." The policeman and the Gradgrinds looked from the old woman to Mr. Bounderby and back again in surprise. What was going on? "I did as you said, Josiah," said the woman. "I never told anyone that I was your mother. I just came to Coketown from time to time to take a peep at you and your fine house, and your factory and your bank. It was a proud peep." Now Mr. Gradgrind stepped forwards. "How dare you?" he said to the woman. "If you are Mr. Bounderby's mother, then you are the woman who deserted him when he was a baby. You left him to his awful grandmother to look after. Mr. Bounderby spent his 10th birthday in a ditch. Deserted my dear Josiah? Never! His father died when Josiah was 8, but I scrimped and saved to make sure Josiah never went without. He was given the best I could afford. I would never have left him." Mr. Bounderby's face turned from white to red. The truth had finally come out. He had not been born in a ditch or abandoned by his mother. He was a liar. The shocking news soon spread through Coketown. Mr. Bounderby's face, once swelled with pride, now sat slumped against his chest like a popped balloon. Back to Sleary's circus. The police were baffled. If the strange old woman had not robbed Mr. Bounderby's bank, then who had? If only the people in Mr. Bounderby's drawing room that afternoon had turned their heads just slightly, they might have known. They might have noticed how uncomfortable Tom Gradgrind seemed, particularly when the policeman mentioned the bank robbery. For the truth was that it was Tom himself who had robbed his employer's bank. He needed the money to pay his gambling debts. Each time someone mentioned the crime, Tom's cheeks flushed and his heart began to beat faster. He was convinced that he was going to be found out. He had to tell someone, but he could not turn to Louisa. He could not bear to see the look of shame on his sister's face. Instead, he turned to Sissy Jupe. "Where can I go?" he asked. "I'm sure the police will work out that I'm guilty if I stay here. But I have very little money and no friends to hide me." Sissy thought for a moment. "My father's old circus," she said. "Sleary's circus. They travel to Liverpool at this time of year. Go to Liverpool and tell the circus that I sent you. They will keep you safe." Tom did as Sissy told him. When Louisa discovered Tom's crime, she was horrified. Mr. Gradgrind was shocked and angry at Tom and at Sissy for keeping it a secret. But he had changed. The pity and love he felt for both of them were stronger than his anger. Mr. Gradgrind and Louisa asked Sissy to take them to Liverpool, to Sleary's circus. The circus was just as Sissy remembered, full of color, light, movement and laughter. It had everything that Coketown did not. Within the brightly striped tent, they found Tom. He was working as a clown, making people smile and laugh, and joking with the other performers, things he had never been able to do before. Mr. Gradgrind's heart sank a little when he saw his son's smiling face. He felt guilty for making his children's lives so dull and dreary. And though he could see that Tom was enjoying the circus, he knew what had to be done. Mr. Gradgrind arranged to sneak Tom on board a ship sailing from Liverpool to America. He, Sissy and Louisa tearfully said goodbye to Tom. Tom, however, didn't feel sad when he waved goodbye to his family. He didn't shed a single tear. It was not until he reached America and realized that he would never see them again that he finally started to miss them. Once they had bid farewell to Tom, Mr. Gradgrind asked Mr. Sleary whether he had any news of Louisa's father. "Oh dear," said Mr. Sleary. "You didn't know?" Merrylegs came back by himself. That dog would never have deserted his master, not as long as he was alive. "I'm afraid that old Jupe must be dead." Mr. Gradgrind turned away. Tears stung his eyes, but he said nothing. His heart was too full. Time moved on, as did the Gradgrind family. Mr. Gradgrind no longer lived by facts and figures. Sissy married and had children. Though she never stopped missing her father, the memories of him now made her smile rather than cry. Louisa did not marry again, after Mr. Bounderby. Instead, she devoted herself to Sissy's children, becoming like a second mother to them. And to Sissy she was, and always would be, a sister.